Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Siddharth Mukherjee from Ambedkar University, Lucknow. Today, we are going to learn about a very important module, the title of which is Meaning, Nature and Forms of Modernization, specially referring to advanced industrial societies of the West. This module has been taken from the paper Comparative Politics, Politics of Advanced Industrial Societies. Now I would make certain introductory remarks. I would mainly mention 4 important points in the introductory part. In the first point, I would mainly talk about the historical emergence of modernization. Students, modernization mainly emerged during Renaissance period. During Renaissance, the reason and rationality in public life was something that was being highlighted. Reason and rationality undermined faith that was a governing principle of public life during the medieval period. So the significant change that we find during Renaissance period and which also characterizes modernization is the dominance of the principles of reason and rationality in public life. The next phase, we find the formation of modern nation states in Western Europe. Now these states are formed on linguistic basis. In other words, language became the major source of division in Western Europe. The next phase is, I would say, a very important phase of modernization. And this phase is known as Industrial Revolution. In fact, many scholars believe that Industrial Revolution is a marker of modernization in Western societies. Now, what changes happened during Industrial Revolution? Industrial Revolution brought about rapid advancement in all spheres of public life, including social, economic, and cultural spheres. It also led to what is called as urbanization, a phenomena in which people migrated from rural to urban areas in search of jobs in the factories. Now, in order to get jobs, they needed education. And as we know, students, during this time, the illiteracy rates were very high. So, what was really important was to establish education institution so that a skilled labor force would be available to the owners of private companies, so that job could be offered to labor with a proper education and skill. The second important thing that happened during Industrial Revolution was the establishment of democratic institutions and constitutions, primarily based on the idea of freedom or liberty. This phenomena was accompanied by economic advancement. We know that democracy is a modern concept, and therefore democratization is a very important aspect of modernization, or I would say democracy is a marker of modernization. So most of the Western countries established modern democratic governments and modern constitutions which embodied the principles of freedom, equality, and liberty. These ideas were primarily introduced during French revolutions, which also became the guiding principle for the government and constitutions in other European societies. Now students, I would highlight the main objectives of this module. I would primarily mention 3 important points. The first is that in this module we are going to look at the meaning of modernization. In order to understand the meaning of modernization, I would be referring to some of the very important definitions given by scholars of comparative politics. The second important aspect that we are going to study in this module is the nature of modernization. Again, in this aspect, I am going to look at the views and perspectives of different scholars of comparative politics. And the third thing that we are going to learn about is the forms of modernization. There are primarily three forms of modernization: political modernity, economic modernity, and socio-cultural modernity. What we are going to do, students, is to learn each of these forms of modernity. Students, let me first talk about the meaning of modernization. And in order to understand the meaning of modernization, I would refer to some of the very, very important definitions of modernization given by some of the prominent scholars of comparative politics and political sociology. The first definition, and which is very important to understand modernization, is given by Anthony Giddens. According to Anthony Giddens, modernization is a specific mode of social life or organization that emerged in Europe around the 17th century and has a worldwide influence. According to Anthony Giddens, modernization basically marks a distinction or demarcation between tradition and modernity. So, Giddens primarily tries to define modernization by drawing a contrast between traditional and modern societies or traditional and modern values. Let me talk about the second important definition given by another very important scholar of comparative modernization named Cyril Black. Cyril Black basically defines modernization at the socio-psychological level by stating that modernity results from expansion of man's knowledge and ability to control the environment and promote and establish new institutions to cope up with modernity. So according to Black, modernity is more about the ability of man to cope up with the advancements of modern societies. It also implies the capability of institutions to cope up with the fast changing values of a modern society. Now let me give you the views of David Apter, who is again a very, very well-known scholar of comparative modernization. For David Apter, there are three important conditions of modernization. The first is the ability of social systems to innovate and adopt new practices required for modern ways of life. Second, differentiated and flexible social structures free of prejudices and biases. Students, let me explain this second point a little bit. David Apter basically tries to emphasize the establishment of institutions and structures that have specific roles to perform. So there is structural differentiation, in that sense becomes a characteristic feature of modern institutions. And these institutions are far removed from the prejudices and biases of social structures. The third important condition mentioned by David Apter for modernity is an appropriate social framework necessary for inculcating new skills and knowledge for sustaining in a technologically advanced world. So the third condition mainly talks about social change. Social change, or a change in the nature of social institutions, by inculcating new skills, new values, new knowledge that are required for sustainability in a modern and advanced society. Now let me give you another very important viewpoint about modernization by a scholar who is very well known in the field of comparative politics called Lucian Pye. Lucian Pye defines political modernization as development syndrome with 4 characteristics. In other words, Lucian Pye defines modernization or political modernization. So his emphasis is on political modernization, and he mentions the following features of political modernization. The first feature of political modernization according to Lucian Pye, is equal opportunity for participation in politics and government formation. It implies that every citizen, irrespective of his caste, class, gender, ethnicity, race, language, is equally entitled to participate in politics and decision-making process of the government. The second important meaning or characteristic feature of political modernization is the capacity and ability of political system and its institutions to formulate public policies and implement them. The third important feature is differentiation of structures and functions, but not overall integration. Let me explain this third point. The third point that Lucian Pye mentioned is about structural differentiation. That modern political systems must create structures which must be entrusted with specific functions. But Lucian Pye also cautions about overall integration. The fourth important point of political modernity is secularization of political process. It implies that politics must be free of parochial or ethnic values. Modern politics must be based on democratic values. Modern politics must be based on dynamism, participation, rationality, and must be far removed from the parochialism of traditional societies. To give one example, secularization would mean a separation of religion and politics. It means that religion is a matter of personal sphere of the individual and must be excluded from politics. In other words, political decisions must not be influenced by religion or religious principles. Political decisions must be taken freely without any bias or prejudice. Let me now mention the views of C.E. Black about modernization. For C.E. Black, there are four important assumptions for modernization. The first is development of capacities or capabilities by the modern political and social institutions. It implies that modern institutions must be such that they will be able to cope up with the advancements of modernity or must be able to inculcate modern values. The second important aspect of modernization is scientific advancement. And modernization is associated with rapid advancements in the field of science and technology. The third important point that C.E. Black mentioned about modernity is about the adoption of advanced knowledge and promotion of development in social, economic, political, and cultural spheres. The fourth important point about modernity, according to C.E. Black, is that the state must make policies that must inculcate modern democratic values. So democracy is the pillar of modernity. A modern political system is purely based on the modern democratic principles of liberty, equality, justice, and fraternity. The principles or values that were echoed in French Revolution. After discussing the meaning of modernity, let me come to the nature of modernity. The best way to understand the nature of modernity is by looking at or understanding the 9 grand processes of modernization as given by C.E. Black. According to C.E. Black, modernization or modernity involves 9 grand processes. So let me discuss these 9 grand processes one by one. Firstly, modernization is seen as a revolutionary change. Modernization is a radical change. It implies that modernity is a complete break from the past. It marks a complete departure from the traditional values. The second important point about modernization is a systematic process. The third important point is that modernization involves multifaceted changes. In other words, modernization involves change or transformation in multiple spheres of public life, including social, political, cultural, and economic. Modernization is a global process. For instance, modernization began in Europe, but then it started spreading over to the rest of the world. Modernization began with Renaissance and later Industrial Revolution in some of the Western countries, and then it became a phenomena in other societies. Modernization is a phased process. In other words, modernization happens in a step-by-step manner. It moves across different stages. So we must understand modernization in a stage-wise fashion. Modernization is a lengthy process. It's a long-drawn process. Modernization has a tendency to homogenize. In other words, modernization tries to establish cultural homogeneity in heterogeneous or multicultural societies by promoting certain universal values of liberalism like equality, liberty, justice, and fraternity. Modernity is irreversible. Once it starts, it cannot be reversed. And related to this is the last feature of modernization, which is that modernization is progressive. It is not regressive. The nature of modernization or modernity has also been understood by a political sociologist, Anthony Giddens. According to Anthony Giddens, the nature of modernity can be understood in terms of three discontinuities or departures from traditions. And these three discontinuities can be understood as follows. The first is the pace of change that happens in a modern society. The second is the scope of change. And the third is intrinsic nature of modern institutions. Let me explain the third point. According to Anthony Giddens, modern institutions inculcate modern values, and their intrinsic nature is very different from the traditional and archaic institution, in the sense that they promote certain democratic values which mark a complete break from the values of traditional societies. Now students, we are going to learn about different forms of modernity. And in this, we would first try to understand economic modernity. Economic modernity in Western societies has been primarily related with the phenomena of capitalism. Now, what is capitalism? Capitalism marks a different phase in the historical evolution of modern Western societies. Capitalism primarily led to change in means and modes of production. The three major means of production in a capitalist system are capital, labor, and land. Capitalism was associated with three important phenomena. The first is industrialization, the second is urbanization, and the third is technological advancement. Let me explain a little bit about these three phenomena that are associated with capitalism. The first is industrialization. Industrialization is something that was undertaken in a very rigorous manner in Western societies. The phenomena, as we all know, began in Britain, and then it started in other Western societies. In industrialization, new factories or manufacturing units were established in different Western societies. Industrialization required a skilled labor force, as a result of which another phenomena happened, which we call as urbanization. Urbanization meant migration of people from rural to urban areas in search of jobs in the newly established factories and manufacturing units. But new industries also require technology. So, industrialization was accompanied by a third phenomena which we call as technological advancement. New inventions and discoveries happened during this period, and this period witnessed rapid advancements in different spheres of science and technology. The second important point that I'm going to discuss about economic modernity is W. Rustow's explanation of 5 stages of economic growth in modern societies. W. Rustow, as we all know, is a very popular economist who tried to understand the phases of economic growth in West European societies. W. Rustow mainly identified 5 important stages of economic modernization. The first stage, according to W. Rustow, was the existence of traditional societies. The second phase was preconditions for takeoff. The third stage was the takeoff stage. The fourth stage was the drive towards maturity. And the final stage was the stage of high mass consumption. Now students, let me explain these 5 stages of economic growth as envisaged by W. Rustow. The first stage is the existence of traditional societies. So during medieval times, we find the existence of traditional societies based on traditional norms and rules. The second stage is called as the preconditions for takeoff. So certain conditions were created for these societies to move to the next stage of economic advancement and industrialization. The third stage is called as the takeoff stage, where industrialization begins. And industrialization is accompanied by two other important phenomena, as I mentioned in the earlier point, which is urbanization and technological advancement. The fourth stage is, as W. Rustow mentioned, is called as the drive towards maturity. Now, during this stage, industrialization reaches a certain level of maturity, where potent or powerful markets gets established in these societies. So, industrialization is accompanied by the establishment of markets in these Western societies. And finally, the last stage of economic growth is the stage of high mass consumption. This stage marks the availability of abundant goods and services in these societies. Now let me explain economic modernity in a more detailed manner. In order to do this, I would mention the views of a very important scholar of comparative politics, Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington tries to understand economic modernity by drawing a contrast between traditional agrarian societies and modern industrial societies. Huntington identifies 3 important differences between traditional agricultural societies and modern industrial societies. The first point of difference is that in agricultural societies, there was a predomination of ascriptive and particularistic identities. So, the relationship in such societies were based on ascriptive or parochial ties. In contrast to this, in industrial societies, there is a predominance of universalistic, specific, and achievement-oriented norms and values. So we find that in industrial societies, merit replaces parochialism as a basis of selection. The second important point of difference is that while in agricultural societies, there was lack of spatial mobility and there was a dominance of local power structures, in industrial societies, there was a high degree of social mobility. Let me explain this point a little bit. In agricultural societies, people were primarily involved in agriculture. So there was no requirement to move to other places. People remained at their at their own native place. So there was very little spatial mobility. In comparison to this, in industrial societies, people moved from rural to urban areas in search of jobs that were being created in new manufacturing industries. The third important point of difference between agricultural and industrial societies, as envisaged by Samuel Huntington, is that in agricultural societies there existed simple and stable occupational differentiation. So the nature of occupation was very simple. There was very little differentiation or distribution of functions. Whereas in case of industrial societies, there existed a well-developed but complex occupational system, generally insulated from the social structure. So modern industrial societies were based on the principles or on the principle of differentiation, or what we call as, and many comparative politics scholars would call as, structural differentiation, which meant that different structures existed to perform specific functions. Now, explaining the concept of economic modernity further, I would mention the views of two very prominent economists of classical economic theory, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. According to these two thinkers, capitalism was found to be the most suitable system of production in modern economies. In their view, capitalism marked the advent of modernization in Western societies. Now, these scholars derived the philosophical justification for capitalism from the doctrine of laissez-faire individualism, a concept that gave primacy to the principle of freedom and liberty. The concept of laissez-faire individualism treated freedom and liberty as supreme values and guiding principles for public policies. So economic freedom in particular became the guiding principles for free trade and free enterprises, the two characteristic features of a capitalist society. Economic modernity finally culminated in the formation of welfare state, more successfully found in Scandinavian countries that witnessed powerful labor movements and formation of social democrat parties. Now, why did these welfare states come up? It was found that capitalism, which was established full-fledgedly after the formation of modern nation states in Western Europe, had led to economic inequalities in Western societies. And this phenomena was something that was observed by many scholars. Economic inequalities were rampant, and trade union became very active in demanding the rights of the labor class. They found that while the capitalist class cornered all the benefits in a capitalist societies, the labor class led wretched lives. As a result of which, the trade union movements became very powerful. There was a fear amongst capitalist governments that if the situation is not handled, then Marxism may emerge in Western societies. As a result of which, they found a middle ground to sort of reconcile with the demands of the labor class, in response to which they established the welfare state, a state which gave certain amount of benefits to the disadvantaged sections of the societies through progressive taxation. Now, welfare state therefore marked a very important phase of economic modernity, where the state became interventionist in nature, in the sense that it taxed the rich to provide social security to the disadvantaged sections of the society. For example, benefits were given to marginalized groups like the senior citizens, the women, the children, and the physically handicapped. Now, let me tell you, students, about a second form of modernity, which is political modernity, and which is a very important subject of concern and study for comparative politics scholars, because as students of politics we are primarily concerned with the study of modernity in the political sphere. To understand political modernity, let me give you the viewpoint of a comparative politics scholar who has dealt extensively with the subject of modernization, Ralph Dahrendorf. According to Dahrendorf, modernization is necessary for democracy, mainly for extending citizenship rights. So modernization is a process which is closely associated with democratization. And this is again associated with the extension of citizenship right, mainly civil and political rights, to those groups or communities which were excluded from these rights and entitlements, like women, peasants, or factory laborers. The path to political modernity has, however, been inconsistent across Europe. For example, in Britain, the path of political modernization has been peaceful and incremental, whereas in case of France, the establishment of modern political institutions has followed a very turbulent path. In France, political modernization became highly turbulent because of constant alteration of or frequent alteration of republics. Political modernity in advanced capitalist countries has assumed mainly two distinct institutional forms, presidential and parliamentary system. And the perfect embodiment of these two of presidential system is United States, and the paragon of parliamentary system is Britain. So the presidential system that was established in United States was followed by countries that intended to establish presidential system. So they saw US as their role model. Whereas those countries which tried to establish parliamentary system mainly emulated Britain. And probably because of this reason, Britain is often referred to as the mother of all parliaments. Now I would specifically refer to the path of political modernization in Britain. As I've mentioned earlier, political modernization in Britain is closely associated with the process of democratization as any other country. And the process of democratization mainly involved two changes. One is the transfer of power to democratic bodies, and number two, the extension of voting rights or enfranchisement of those groups that were excluded from the voting rights. The process of democratization is mainly traced to Magna Carta and Glorious Revolution in Britain. These two transformations or these two changes that happened mainly involved transfer of power to the parliament. Earlier, the power was concentrated in the office of monarch. Magna Carta and Glorious Revolution led to a transfer of power to the parliament, in the sense that parliament became sovereign. The principle of parliamentary sovereignty came to be established by Britain. The second important aspect of modernization and democratization in Britain was the extension of voting rights to workers, peasants, and women. And as I have mentioned earlier, the process took a long time. These groups had to struggle for their voting rights, and it took a long time for the government to provide voting rights to these communities. The two parliamentary acts that have been very significant in democratizing or modernizing the British political systems are the Parliamentary Acts of 1911 and 1949. These two acts are mainly known for transferring the authority to the House of Commons in financial matters. As we know that House of Commons consists of members who are direct representatives of people and is therefore a more democratic body than House of Lords, which mainly represents the aristocratic class. So democratization in Britain required the transfer of power from House of Lords to the House of Commons, the body which truly represented the people. In 1997, the government also took important steps to abolish hereditary peerage in House of Lords. So this change curtailed one of the major powers of the House of Lords. And finally, in 2009, the government took very important steps to curtail the judicial powers of House of Lords. Let me now come to France. As I have mentioned earlier, France witnessed a lot of turbulence in establishing modern political institutions. So, the process of political modernization in France, democratization in France, has not been as smooth as it was in Britain. In France, we find that there's been an alteration between autocratic regimes and democratic government since the Declaration of Rights of Man in 1789. So France has not had stable governments as it has altered between different republics. To begin with, Napoleon dictatorship established an autocratic or authoritarian regime in France. But after the collapse of the Napoleon regime, the Third and the Fourth Republics were established, and these two republics were a very important step towards democratizing the political system in France. The Third and Fourth Republics mainly established a strong parliament and weak executive. So basically, the Third and Fourth Republics in France was based on the principle or adopted the principle of parliamentary sovereignty and therefore made the parliament much stronger than the executive. But in Fifth Republic, under Charles de Gaulle's, a strong presidency replaced a strong parliament, as a result of which the constitution that came to be established under Fifth Republic made the president very strong and the parliament very weak. Now let me discuss a third case study, which is United States. United States, as I've mentioned earlier, is a role model of presidential system for all other countries. In United States, the presidential system was based on the two major principles, that is separation of power and checks and balances. So these two were the guiding principles of American Constitution. Let me explain these two principles a little bit. Separation of power was primarily based on the principle of structural differentiation, which meant that the Constitution would assign a specific set of power and responsibilities to the three major institutions of the government, that's legislature, executive and the judiciary. So they would have their own areas of jurisdiction. But it also adopted the principle of checks and balances in order to keep a check on the powers of each of these institutions. It was found that there have been times when these institutions have bypassed their powers, but their powers were checked through the principle of checks and balances. For example, I would give an example to illustrate the principle of checks and balances. For example, the president controls the legislature by the power of veto. So a bill cannot become a law unless it gets the consent of the president. Similarly, the legislature, which is called as the Congress in United States, exercises its control over the president by having the power of impeachment. But impeachment is a very complicated process and is carried out very rarely. In the history of United States, there's probably been one impeachment case, but the president was saved by one vote. So virtually no president of United States has been impeached till now. The American Constitution, as we know, is a written constitution and is primarily based on the principle of popular sovereignty. This is in contrast or in comparison with the British Constitution, that adopted the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. The model of modern political institution in United States, or the presidential system in United States, was something that many countries were attracted to. As a result of which, the presidential system was adopted in countries like Canada, countries of Latin America, Sri Lanka, and many smaller nations in Southeast and East Asia, although with certain modification. These modifications were made primarily in view of the socio-economic cultural context of these societies. Let me come to the third important type of modernity, which is social and cultural modernity. Social and cultural modernity mainly implies modern ways of political socialization, where people tend to go beyond their ascriptive identities and recognize themselves as citizens. In other words, in modern societies, the identity of citizenship is beyond other kinds of identities, or is considered to be more important and salient than other kinds of social or parochial identities. So, people must first recognize themselves as citizens before recognizing themselves as being members of certain caste, clan, community, and so on and so forth. Gabriel Armand, a very well-known scholar of comparative politics and a scholar who gave, the theory of structural functionalism, well defines social and cultural modernity as secularization of culture. Secularization of culture implies that the political structures and political culture are reinforcing in stable political system, which he calls as cultural congruence. So, modern political culture is what defines secularization of culture, and modern political culture is based on democratic values. Modern political culture or secularization culture would imply a shift from traditional culture based on parochial norms and practices to a more modern, participatory, dynamic political culture, which is a characteristic feature of modern democratic societies. Now, let me elaborate a little more on social and cultural modernity. Therefore, I would mention the viewpoint of Karl Deutsch, who has dealt extensively with this subject. Karl Deutsch advocates that social mobilization happens to a large number of people in areas which undergo modernization, where advanced non-traditional practices in culture, technology, and economic life are introduced and accepted on a considerable scale. So Karl Deutsch mainly tries to understand social and cultural modernity in terms of social mobilization, where people adopt modern values and try to inculcate values and practices in order to cope up with the advancements of modern societies, or with the technological advancement of modern social life. Social cultural modernity also involves qualitative changes in lifestyles that lead to changing political perceptions and behavior, and there is mass participation in politics. So, social and cultural modernity also brings about changes in the political views, opinions, and perceptions of people. People start thinking differently when they are exposed to modern lifestyle. They inculcate new values, they become conscious of their political rights, and therefore they tend to participate extensively in politics. So, what social and cultural modernity leads to is mass participation in politics. Now, students, we would summarize the points that we have discussed in this module. I would primarily mention two concluding points. The first point is that in politics, modernity gets linked with the liberal democratic institutional forms of the West, particularly the Anglo-American model. The modernization theory particularly believes that the Anglo-American institutional model is a paragon, or a perfect model that needs to be emulated by other countries. This model primarily highlights the aspects of structural differentiation, universal adult franchise, and more importantly, a phenomena or a concept that was being given by Gabriel Armand called secularization of culture. So these three features are something that is very important for modern political institutions. But the nature of modernity in the 20th century appeared to be slightly different from the view that is being mentioned in the earlier point. Modernity in 20th century is primarily characterized as high rates of social mobilization and increasing participation of people in the political process. We find that during earlier times, participation was restricted. So masses did not participate in the political process. But as enfranchisement took place for different social categories in Western countries, participation expanded. So, but in 20th century, we find that the participation of people expanded rapidly in most of the Western societies. And the other phenomena that became very prominent during 20th century is the high rates of social mobilization. That a large mass of people started moving from rural to urban areas in order to get education and in order to find new jobs in the market. Thank you.